In this video, we're looking at what is known as the problem of evil. That's not the same thing as looking at evil as a problem. The problem of evil is a technical term. It's a term used in philosophy of religion, and it's often used as a challenge to those who believe in God. In this video, we're not so much looking at answering the problem of evil as just laying out the groundwork really for ensuring that any discussions which go on around this problem are done sensibly and there's a completeness in the way that the issue is addressed. In order to have the problem of evil, you've got to have a starting point of the God of classical theism. And God of classical theism includes the attributes of omnibenevolent, in other words, all good, all loving, and also omnipotent, all powerful. And alongside those two, there is the fairly obvious statement that evil exists in the world. So what we have then is that God, the God of classical theism then, if omnibenevolent, all good, then God would not wish us to suffer unnecessarily. And if God is omnipotent, he's all powerful, then God is able to prevent us from suffering unnecessarily. And if God created the world which contains evil, then it does rather look as if God created evil and suffering. This is laid out very well by J.L. Mackie in what he calls the inconsistent triad. Very straightforward, very simple. You've got a triangle. Three ideas here: omnipotence, omnibenevolence, and evil. And so Mackie says, pretty straightforwardly, he says only two of these can be put together. As soon as the third is added, it becomes inconsistent. Okay, so let's say that in Mackie's own words. In its simplest form, the problem is this: God is omnipotent, God is wholly good, and yet evil exists. There seems to be some contradiction between these three propositions, so that if any two of them were true, the third would be false. But at the same time, all three are essential parts of most theological positions. The theologian, it seems, at once must adhere and cannot consistently adhere to all three. It's not a new problem at all. We could go back to Epicurus. Here we are, he's sort of 3rd, 4th century BC, and he's generally credited with the first person to really lay this problem out in its modern form. Either God wants to abolish evil and cannot, or he can but does not want to. If he wants to but cannot, he's impotent. If he can but does not want to, he is wicked. If God can abolish evil and God really wants to do it, why is there evil in the world? The problem of evil is sometimes divided into two different components. One is the logical, so in other words, the mere existence of evil is logically incompatible with the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God. And the other one, often called evidential. This is looking just simply at the sheer quantity of evil that exists in the world and saying that's incompatible with the existence of an all-loving, all-powerful God. Now, fairly obviously, there's quite a lot of overlap between those two, and I'm not going to go into the difference between them, but it's worth bearing in mind that there are subtle differences between those two approaches. Now, it's incredibly important to engage with the fact that the problem of evil is not a challenge to the existence of God. You very often find in these, your standard debates between, the Christian and the atheist, that they get bogged down in discussing the problem of evil. And the implication seems to be that if the atheist can win on this one and really clearly identify that the problem of evil just means that the Christian position is incoherent, that doesn't even remotely mean that his position, the atheist position, is correct. All it does is it challenges a particular understanding of God, not the existence of God itself. So the problem of evil is only a problem for those who believe in God, who is omnipotent, that's the all-powerful, omnibenevolent, or loving. So you only need to tweak a couple of those. If you, the easiest one is to just modify what you mean by all loving, and then the problem of evil promptly evaporates. But it's not an argument for atheism, it is an argument against a particular understanding of God. So to ask the question, how could God allow this, is a variety of options. Here's two. It's a challenge to someone who believes in a God of classical theism, or alternatively, it's a statement of belief in such a God, but at the same time identifies just profound questions that such a belief presents to the holder of those beliefs. And the problem of evil is not equally problematic for all positions, all theistic positions, or all positions with theist-deist underpinnings. The problem of evil is really most acute within Christianity, because Christianity has got within it a very strong sense of a loving God, so that omnibenevolence is really to the fore. On top of that, you've got also the concept of the incarnation. Now what this does is this says that God really is interested in this world that he has created. He's not really interested in it, he's actively involved in the world. He's so interested and actively involved that incarnation, he became incarnate in Jesus, God become man. There's also in Christianity a propensity to attempt theology as if it were geometry. We'll look at that facet of the debate later. Of the Abrahamic belief systems, that's Judaism, Christianity and Islam, Islam is probably the least troubled by the problem of evil. The Islamic view of God is far more distant, it's non-incarnational, and also the Muslims are far less inclined to work so heavily with propositional knowledge that attempts in theology as if they're doing geometry, and more of that shortly. Deists are pretty unconcerned, because for a deist, God is pretty distant and impersonal. And that's the line really which says that God created the universe, but then basically just let it get on with itself. And of course, the problem of evil is not even remotely a problem. It's just a completely non-issue for any monist system, so that's Buddhism or Hinduism, and also for primal religions with that sort of polytheistic, pantheistic understanding. And it's important to hold that in mind, because as already said, when the atheist is challenging the Christian, it might be, it's a profound challenge to Christianity, but even if the atheist wins over the Christian and identifies that the Christian really can't stand up against the problem of evil, that doesn't even remotely mean that the atheist position, the philosophical materialist position, to be more strictly accurate, is correct. There could be God, there could be spirit, there could be all sorts of divine type elements in the universe. It just means that the God of classical theism within Christianity doesn't stand up. And of course, the philosophical materialist position, the problem of evil just simply, again, it's just not there even remotely. In fact, it's difficult to see how you could have anything that you could even call evil. Here's a famous Richard Dawkins quote from River Out of Eden. If the universe were just electrons and selfish genes, meaningless tragedies like the crashing of this bus, that's a bus full of school children he'd mentioned earlier, are exactly what we should expect, along with equally meaningless good fortune. Such a universe would be neither evil nor good in intention. It would manifest no intentions of any kind. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason in it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good, nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither cares nor knows. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. And so that philosophical materialist position, there's no evil. There's just no such thing as evil. It's just meaningless. It's just stuff that happens. The universe is unfolding from the Big Bang, and the matter in the universe is just doing what it happens to do because of previous state of the universe. And to talk about anything as good or evil is no more than just some sort of subjective emotional response that we are giving, but there is really no concept of evil at all. What I want to do now is what I'm calling opening up the question. So this is not so much answering it or addressing the question, it's more about ensuring that we are asking well formulated questions and that we are looking at a complete spectrum of possible ways of addressing this issue. The first aspect of this I want to have a look at is that the problem of evil is generated by attempting to understand God in terms of propositional statements and then bring them together in some rationally understandable whole and doing the whole thing similar to geometry. Okay, well, what if God actually cannot be understood in terms of propositional statements? Maybe we can't approach God in the same way that we do geometry. Okay, let's dip into a bit of epistemology. This is theory of knowledge. This is the study of what we mean when we say we know something. We'll start with propositional, knowing that something is the case. Now, this is the type of knowledge which tends to be used in these arguments for related to the problem of evil. So it's knowing that something is the case, knowing that there is a cat sitting on the mat, knowing that 2 + 2 = 4. It's a very straightforward type of knowledge. But incredibly importantly, that's not the only type of knowledge. And actually, when we look at the way we live, it's not even remotely the most important part of knowledge. And so we need to make sure that as we are looking at the problem of evil, we don't limit it entirely to propositional knowledge type statements. As we've got procedural knowing, this is knowing how to do things, know how to catch a ball. Somebody throws a ball to you and you catch it. A personal one to me, knowing how to ride a motorbike. I mean, a very bizarre one, which you might be able to get on a bicycle. Never quite worked that one out, but certainly on a motorbike, you've got a long sweeping bend. I can take a motorbike round that bend very easily. But even trying to think about what I'm doing as I do it, I don't really know how I'm doing it. It's just embedded knowledge in terms of how I do things. And then perspectival. This is about the inner experience. Being technical here, it's these are often referred to as qualia, and what it's like to experience redness. I can't describe that other than say, well, it's red. It's an experience of red, or it's an experience of pain. It's an experience of sweetness. We know what it's like. It's just that awareness of my experience of what it's like right now for me. There's then participative. This is a very complicated one, so I'll just sort of point vaguely in the direction. The most important aspect of it is just to say this is yet another type of knowing and making sure that we aren't just locked into this propositional. So participative, what does that mean? It's being bound into probably someone, binding your identity to someone, and you are transformed in relationship with that other person. So it's a transformation of the totality of your being, so some existential knowing. The most important aspect here is just being aware that knowledge is not simply that propositional knowledge, and therefore being able to work in these very straightforward statements that you can put in some sort of syllogistic logical statement. And linked to that, we'll go to Blaise Pascal, a 17th century mathematician and philosopher, and he made a distinction which is really useful to engage with. And he talks about the spirit of geometry and the spirit of finesse. What does he mean by that? Well, the spirit of geometry, this is when you approach things with rigorous deduction, and you can just go to very straight line, clear, indubitable conclusions. This again is back to our propositional statements. You line your propositional statements up as a syllogism, and if your syllogism you've got true premises and you've got sound logic, the conclusion must be true. Okay, fixing a motorcycle that's not running, that again is the spirit of geometry, so doing engineering. Now the spirit of finesse is completely different. It's this idea that you can't argue without error about some very specific part without losing a vision of the full complexity, or alternatively maintain the full complexity of the huge system that you're trying to deal with. You're going to end up with things which are probably in error down at the details of it. That's a very simple example. Is you don't try and fix your relationship with your girlfriend or boyfriend in the way that you do syllogistic logic. And I'm trying to sort things out with my wife. I don't do it in the same way that I would do it if I was problem solving as to why the bike is not at the moment running properly. So as we bring in this issue of epistemology, and making sure that we are dealing with this full range of knowing about God and knowing how we can reconcile evil with the existence of a loving God, then what we're doing here, we're bringing into these explorations the Christian, and it's the Christian who's got to present these arguments to defend the problem of evil against the challenge from the philosophical materialists. And what it's doing is it's saying, no, on the table, as we look at wrestling with this issue, and it's unquestionably enormously complicated, but we've got to bring in the existential, the relational understanding of God, and a relational understanding of God which is comfortable with the ineffable. Now, fairly obviously, if something's ineffable, then you can't deal with it as you would a geometry problem. You can't deal with it with syllogistic logic because it's ineffable. And so therefore that line would be willing to deal with mystery. The problem of evil is ultimately a mystery. And so also that would bring in the ability to use arguments along the lines that you find in the book of Job. So to the end of the book, you've got the answer. It's laid out pretty fully in chapters 40 and 41. Basically, God says to Job, have you ever built a universe? Please don't try and tell me how it's supposed to be done. So if we look at an extract from Job 38, which gives a flavour of this line of arguments. This is God speaking to Job. Have you ever given orders to the morning or shown the dawn its place? Have you journeyed to the springs of the sea or walked in the recesses of the deep? Have the gates of death been shown to you? Have you comprehended the vast expanses of the earth? Tell me if you know all this. Have you entered the storehouses of the snow or seen the storehouses of the hail? What is the way of the place where the lightning is dispersed, or the place where the east winds are scattered over the earth? Who cuts a channel for the torrents of rain and a path for the thunderstorm, to water a land where no man lives, who fathers the drops of dew? Can you bind the beautiful Pleiades? Can you loose the cords of Orion? Can you bring forth the constellations in their seasons, or lead out the bear with its cubs? Do you know the laws of the heavens? And so really what we're doing there is bringing in and putting it on the table poetry to address this question of the problem of evil. Mystery, just an acknowledgement of just how little we do actually know And there's a huge amount about the universe we really don't know, and so it's saying a bit of humility here in terms of telling God how he should have made the universe. We need to make sure we do some clarification of terms as well here. We need to get our semantics right. We need to be aware of those terms which require defining and require discussion over definition, because the definition is anything but clear. And it's only when we engage in these discussions with an awareness of the complexity of some of these terms that we've got any hope at all of making decent progress. So if we go back to a slide that we had earlier on in the presentation, and it was this one here. If all good, then God would not wish us to suffer unnecessarily. If omnipotent, then God is able to prevent us from suffering unnecessarily. And if God created the world which contains evil, then it seems God created evil. Now, on face value, you know, it's pretty straightforward, but actually it isn't, because we've got this word good. That's pretty central, really, because one of those omnis that's causing the problem that's generating the issues for Mackie's triad is this word good, omnibenevolent good. Well, are we sure? Do we really know what we mean by good? And even if we can manage to work out what we might mean by good when we're dealing with humans on Earth, how are we going to then say that we know what good is when referring to God? And we've got to take theists seriously. If you've got a genuinely rigorous and intellectually rigorous understanding of God, then God is pretty vast. God is ultimately beyond our comprehension. And so we're very careful if we think we can say that we know what the word good means when we're applying it to God. We've also got this another qualifier here in terms of the suffering, because we've got this word unnecessarily, and it's in both those first two ideas. Well, if the suffering could be shown to have some purpose within God's good creation, then an answer could emerge to the problem of evil. So we've again got to really make sure that we're engaging with this idea. What do we mean by necessary suffering and unnecessary suffering? And then we've got this word evil. There is evil in the world, and it seems as if God created this evil. That's one which is worth looking at in some detail, and so that's where we'll go now. As we discuss evil, it's incredibly easy to talk about it as if it's some sort of substance, an actual part of the created order, and therefore you say it's created by God. Now, another way of looking at it is, in fact, that's not the best way of understanding evil, that evil actually is better understood as an absence of good. Now, before we explore that further, we need to just make sure we've got the essence of the problem here, that within the Judeo-Christian tradition, we've got this concept of Creatio ex nihilo. God created the universe from nothing. So there was absolutely nothing, and then God spoke the universe into existence, which means that absolutely everything in the universe, without any exception at all, has its origin in God. God is totally responsible for every aspect of it. And so then you go from that, okay, we see evil in the world, okay, is God therefore responsible for evil? Okay, let's play with a couple of analogies to help us get into this. And let's start with the analogy of dark and light to help us understand good and evil. Okay, well, light is what exists. Light can be understood as a substance. It can be measured. It is energy. Now, dark is not in any way a substance. It's simply the absence of light. So the more light there is, then the less darkness. And so we would never say, where's all this darkness come from? We'd ask instead, who turned out the light? Now, the analogy works quite nicely, really, because light and dark are primal symbols for good and evil, respectively. Okay, and let's move on to heat, hot and cold. Now, these are analogies, so they're not a sort of argument in the syllogistic sense. They are analogies, they're ways of looking at things to open up our thinking, open up our imagination, and help us to get a better grip on what it is that we are discussing. Okay, so cold. In normal conversation, we would often use the word cold. It's cold out today. Close the door, keep out the cold. Technically, however, there's no such thing as cold. There are only different degrees of heat. Okay, back to evil then. So the question we're exploring is whether evil is a substance, where you could then say God created evil, or whether evil is simply a lack of good, which would be God created good, and a lack of it is that God's responsibility? It certainly changes the question. And what we're trying to do is say, well, let's just look at the cold and heat bit. Cold is a lack of heat. It's heat, which is the actuality, the substance, if you like. And cold is no more than a way that humans talk about heat when it gets to a certain point on the scale. Let's look at these two women then out walking their dogs in the winter. And one of them says, oh, seriously cold today. She's just using normal English usage. The other, the woman, is a scientist, pedantic scientist, and so she's bemused by this statement, and so she says, actually there's plenty of heat. We're at about 270 degrees today. Now, she's using she's measuring in degrees Kelvin. Absolute zero is 0 degrees Kelvin. 0 degrees K is minus 273.15 degrees C. It's questionable whether you can actually ever get there. That's completely irrelevant to our discussion. But as far as that scientist is concerned, temperature is about 270, and there's bucket loads of heat around. As far as they're concerned, it's pretty cold because that's minus 3 degrees C. Okay, let's move back to evil and see what that would look like if we use the same understanding there. And so we got here's our image. It's children in one of the death camps during the Nazi era in Europe, and powerful symbol of evil, difficult to find a better one. And so you've got normal English usage. The Holocaust was seriously evil. Okay, and then we get the pedantic theologian. Just think back to our women walking the dogs and the pedantic physicist. And the pedantic theologian says, well, actually, no, there's plenty of good here. We're on about 250 of the goodness scale. Stalin got down to 190, and Mao got down to 120. So if you've got the idea that goodness is the substance, if we're going to use that term, then you could say, well, even the death camps hadn't reached 0 of goodness. There was still some goodness there. It's usual to divide evil up into 2 categories, which is can be quite helpful. One is moral evil, and that's the evil caused by moral agents through choice. Really, that only applies to humans, and that doesn't deal with the problem of evil, but it pushes it into the whole discussion about God giving humans free will. But then you've got what's known as natural evil, and so that's what we would call evil, so suffering caused by earthquakes, illness, etc. Nothing at all to do by human choice, human action. Looks as if it's pretty directly the responsibility of God. So people get killed by a tsunami. That's down to tectonic plates. That's not humans. We can't shift tectonic plates around. So it's worth bearing those 2 different categories in mind during the discussion. Christians who want to argue that it is coherent to believe in God who is omnibenevolent, omnipotent, and also omniscient, and also you've got evil in the world, those presentations to say, no, that actually doesn't make sense, they're known as Theodicies. They're Christian answers to the problem of evil. And as we look at these Theodicies, it's important to go back to that idea of the importance of epistemology. that the Christian believer, when looking at the problem of evil, is looking at a range of, we'll call them arguments, for want of a better term, and these cumulatively point to God and anything else within that faith position. Say that all this range of understandings, range of knowledge, indicates that God is the best, or at the very least it's a pretty good set of hypotheses to explain the evidence. And incredibly important, the Christian believer wants to bring in all facets of knowing. A very important one is religious experience, which is of course accessible only to the person who is experiencing it. Now, the philosophical materialist, when approaching the problem of evil, tends in the direction of saying, no, I want a single, defensible, inductive or deductive argument which covers all aspects of belief in God and uses only publicly accessible evidence in the same way as concepts of the sciences, both physical and social. So in other words, they want to say, no, unless you can deal with this with the spirit of geometry, then I'm not interested. We are only going to allow propositional statements on the table in this discussion. The major problem with this approach from the philosophical materialist is that it could be like, this is an argument from analogy again, it could be like someone demanding that somebody demonstrates that this huge complex structure that they say exists in its totality, and a lot of it is made of wood and plaster and plastics and cloth and glass, and they've got to demonstrate that that exists, but the person who is demanding that says, and the only thing you're allowed to use is a metal detector. That's all you're going to be allowed to use in the search and providing data to show that this structure exists. And I'm going to reject any evidence from any source other than the metal detector. There are lots of Theodicies. I'm not going to deal with those here. Really, this video is just simply about laying out the parameters in which you can have a sensible discussion, a complete discussion, and ensure that everything is on the table. Making sure that the philosophical materialist is not going to just dictate the terms of the discussion. And probably the most important element of this is ensuring a good understanding of epistemology, a good understanding of all those different forms of knowing about God that are available, and rejecting the demand that only propositional statements are allowed on the table. Demanding that we approach God with the, using Pascal's terms, demanding that God can only be approached with the spirit of geometry, when in fact it's entirely plausible. If God in fact does exist, as Christians say, then in fact it would be most appropriate to engage with God with a spirit of finesse.